Mayslake, in DuPage County, Illinois, is a storied location. For many people, Mayslake is about the tale of the Peabodys, wealthy patrons who first gathered together various tracts of rural land to create an idyllic gentleman's farm with the Tudor mansion centerpiece. Others consider it as a longtime place of Roman Catholic retreats, led by Franciscan friars in a quiet country setting with muted rites and introspective sermons. Still others recall it as a place of teenage adventure, evading dogged cloaked men while attempting to find a mysterious tomb in a secret chapel in the woods. More recent arrivals may think of it as a quiet, secluded nature preserve, ideal for reconnecting with the landscape or spending time alone with one's thoughts, or even as a noteworthy venue for dramatic tragedies and uplifting comedies.
There is, of course, truth in all of these tales. And in this video, we'll attempt to take you through the many scenes that make up the Mayslake Peabody Passion Play. And we'll begin at the beginning, long before the arrival of Europeans from the East, in the first act for this story, when Native Americans roamed this open land.
Primary sources for this video include conversations with Peabody and Mayslake historical researchers Jackson Hartley, David Hill, and Linda Neff. The DuPage County Forest Preserve District Archives, DuPage County History Museum Researches and Archives, period newspaper articles, period census records and vital records, period maps, period aerial photographs.
Long prior to the arrival of U.S. and European settlers, Native Americans lived and roamed across the broad landscape of northern Illinois. Early people would have come into a rich environment of open prairie, pocketed here and there with deciduous forests of oak, elm, and hazel. Occasional wetlands provided forage and cover for wildfowl and game. Abundant streams and small rivers coursed through its valleys and hollows.
The Potawatomi were the last major tribe to have moved into the area in the late 1700s, coming from their ancestral home to the north and east. They had historically documented encampments just a mile to the west of Mayslake, along the Salt Creek, on land in what is today the Fullersburg Woods Forest Preserve. People of the Fox and Sauk tribes also roamed these lands. The prairie, forests, and wetlands of the Mayslake terrain would have been a well-used setting for small hunting parties or extended families gathering seasonal resources such as nuts, berries, herbs, and roots.
Europeans, primarily the French via their Canada colonies, began exploring the area in the latter part of the 17th century. Most notable among these explorers were Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette, the former for trade opportunities, the latter for saving human souls. The French ceded control of the area to the British in the 1763 Treaty of Paris, following their loss in the French and Indian War. After the American War of Independence in 1776, and the subsequent relentless push westward by the newly formed United States, what is today the state of Illinois became part of the Northwest Territory, then the Indiana Territory, followed by the Illinois Territory in 1809. At this time, the region of Illinois was being populated by U.S. settlers from the bottom upwards, most people coming in via the Ohio River.
On its way to statehood, early Illinois settlers conflicted with Native Americans, such as the Sauk, Fox, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and others, as this was their territory, their hunting grounds, their home. One particularly sensitive area in this conflict was a trail used by early traders and settlers, taking them from the shores of Lake Michigan in Chicago to Ottawa via the Des Plaines River. In fact, it was referred to as the Chicago Portage. As part of the Treaty of St. Louis, negotiated in 1816 with the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, a boundary line was drawn that passed diagonally southwest from Lake Michigan to the Kankakee River. in parallel with the Chicago Portage, in a 20-mile wide corridor, allowing safe passage for early traders to and from Chicago and Ottawa.
Illinois achieved statehood in 1818, with most of its population in the southern half of the state. The Indian Boundary Line, as it was so called, went out of effect with the Treaty of Chicago in 1833, when Native American tribes were completely driven out of their former homeland, which set in motion the rapid settlement of the northern portion of the state. As we shall see, this former boundary line passed directly through the Mayslake region and affected when the properties became available for settlement and purchase from the U.S. government.
The lands south of the Indian boundary line were first officially surveyed in 1822, followed by a second survey in 1834. The year 1839 saw the opening of public land sales of the lands to the south of the Indian boundary line. Most of the land in the Mayslake area, which includes sections 34 and 35 of York Township and sections 2 and 3 of Downers Grove Township, was bought up by speculators from Chicago and New York, as well as some local residents. Lawrence Grove, a wealthy attorney and judge from Syracuse, New York, was among the primary early purchasers. A few parcels close to the boundary line went unpurchased at this time, perhaps due to their odd size or concerns regarding legal issues with the former boundary.
The lands north of the Indian boundary line were officially surveyed by the U.S. government in 1842, with these lands being put up for public sale in 1844. By 1848, almost all of the available public lands in the Mayslake area had been purchased, including most, but not all, of the odd-shaped parcels along the boundary line. The final remaining piece, approximately 1 acre in size, was not sold until 1865. Most of these early land purchases were for trade or speculation, not for permanent settlement or putting down roots. By 1874, only a single family, the Sukers, remained from the original public land buyers.
However, it was in the latter part of the 19th century when much of this landscape was reshaped, modified for farming and agriculture. Land was cleared of trees and scrub. Rough dirt roads emerged. Swampy areas were drained. Wood-frame farmhouses and barns were raised. Fences were installed demarking property lines, as much to keep livestock in as to keep interlopers out. Crop fields gave wheat and corn. Garden patches supplied vegetables. Orchards provided fruit and hard cider. Dairy farms yielded milk and cheese, while poultry farms furnished eggs, feathers, and Sunday dinner. By the early 1900s, about 20 farms, ranging in size from 13 acres to 240 acres, operated on what was to become the Mayslake properties.
Francis Stuyvesant Peabody was born on July 24, 1859, to Francis Bowles Peabody and Harriet Cutter Tenbrook in the fledgling city of Chicago, Illinois. The couple were New England transplants to the area, and Francis Sr. was an affluent attorney and mortgage banker. Harriet was a descendant of one of the early Dutch families that emigrated to New York in the mid-1600s, and the Stuyvesant name came through her line, likely being a place name for one of several possible locations in the Netherlands. Francis' family likewise had deep American roots, the Peabodys also arriving in the mid-1600s, but from England, with prominent ancestry in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. The Peabodys were Episcopalians by faith.
Young Francis Stuyvesant attended the engineering school at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, graduating in 1881. With such a family pedigree, and being the firstborn son, he was expected to follow in his father's footsteps and join his father's law firm. And indeed he did. But the law apparently was not to his liking, and he instead seemed to discover his true passion, the business of buying and selling for profit. With $100 of his personal savings, which is close to $5,000 in today's money, in 1884, he founded F.S. Peabody and Company, where he bought Pennsylvania Lehigh coal wholesale and sold retail to Chicago consumers and businesses in what was then a world where coal energy was king for heating and steam-generated power. In early 1887, F.S. Peabody took as a business partner another coal dealer, more than 10 years his senior, Edwin F. Daniels, to help grow and manage his burgeoning coal company.
Later that year, in November of 1887, Francis S. Peabody took another partner, this one in marriage, to 22-year-old May Henderson at St. Clement's Episcopal Church at the corner of State and 20th Streets in Chicago, in what was billed as the high society event of the season. May Henderson was the daughter of Dr. Frederick Henderson and Sarah Dyer of Oneida County, New York. Her father, however, had died in 1870, when she was only 5 years old. Her mother then remarried to Chicago brewing magnate John H. McAvoy in 1884, when May was 19 years of age. Francis and May's first child, a son, Stuyvesant, was born the following year, in August of 1888.
Meanwhile, the Peabody-Daniels alliance was short-lived, and their partnership formally dissolved in January of 1889. But the Peabody-Henderson marriage partnership was sufficiently strong enough to yield a second child, a daughter, May, born in 1891. The young Peabody family was then living in a fashionable neighborhood along Asbury Avenue in Evanston. The Peabody Coal Company had by now become very successful, situated on the 4th floor of the Davidson and Sons building at Market Street, having won major contracts with the city of Chicago and Cook County. In an interesting move, Francis made his first foray into politics in an unsuccessful bid for Cook County Sheriff in 1894 on the Democratic ticket, ironically running against a man named James Pease in a heated Pease-Peabody race.
In the latter 1890s and early 1900s, Peabody developed a friendship and business relationship with Samuel Insull, a contemporary and an Englishman, who was himself building an electric utility and transportation empire within the U.S. Midwest. Peabody's company would become the primary coal supplier for Insull's steam-powered generators, which would turn fossil fuels into electricity, a technology that was transforming U.S. housing, industry, and transportation.
Peabody built on this business success, purchasing dozens of coal mines in central and southern Illinois, as well as several other states, including Indiana, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Washington, and Wyoming. He was effectively creating a vertical monopoly, a wealth-building practice rising out of the Gilded Age. More politely known as vertical integration, it is a method by which companies acquire and control all aspects of the supply chain, from raw materials, manufacturing, transportation, distribution, and finally sales. His coal companies were producing and selling 12 million tons of coal per annum in the mid-1910s. Peabody and his company were becoming an industrial juggernaut on a national scale. Extremely successful, yes, but all-consuming of his energy and time.
His wife May, however, was more interested in seeing the world and traveling, activities for which her husband Francis had little time. U.S. immigration records indicate that May traveled internationally with her 2 children in 1896, then again with her children and her mother, Sarah Dyer McAvoy, in 1899, on another occasion with daughter May in 1904, and then later with a nurse and servant in 1906. These were extended trips via ocean liner, typically lasting months at a time, mostly to locations in Europe, but also places in the Caribbean, such as Havana, Cuba. Perhaps growing apart, during one of these lengthy trips in 1900, U.S. Census records indicate that Francis was living by himself in an apartment along Michigan Avenue, rather than at his home. By
the early 1900s, the Peabodys had moved to Lincoln Park Boulevard, now Michigan Avenue, in the area today referred to as the Magnificent Mile, living among some of the wealthiest residents of Chicago. However, at this time of societal success, the Peabody family was visited by death, and on multiple occasions. Francis lost his mother, Harriet Ten Broeck Peabody, in 1901, and May Henderson Peabody experienced the death of her mother, Sarah Dyer McAvoy, in 1905. Soon after, in what was to be her final trip abroad, May Henderson Peabody, Francis's wife of 19 years, mother of Stuyvesant and May, passed away in Nice, France, on November 27, 1906, after a brief bout with typhoid fever. She left an estate to her 2 children in the form of real estate and personal property, valued at $20,000, or about $500,000 in today's money, to be held in trust until her children came of age. In something of a final emotional blow, less than 2 years following the death of his wife, in January of 1908, Francis lost his father, Francis Bowles Peabody.
It is difficult to say how Francis reacted to these deaths of his wife and his parents, but it may have cut him loose from his moorings, an unsettling samsara for a man who was used to controlling his world. Rather than withdraw, he threw himself into managing the finances and campaign of Adlai Stevenson's run for Illinois governor on the Democratic ticket, which Stevenson lost in a close race. However, somehow and somewhere in this whirlwind spell, he had the improbable introduction to Mary Ann Sullivan, a recent widow of James William Bryant. Whereas Francis Peabody had English blue blood ancestry, Mary Ann Sullivan had decidedly blue-collar roots, born into a large Irish Catholic working-class family. Her father was Maurice Sullivan, an itinerant Irish immigrant railroad worker and construction foreman. Her mother was Bridget, or Mary Healy, also a recent immigrant from Ireland.
Mary Ann Sullivan, born around 1873 in Galesburg, Illinois, may have been married to James W. Bryant in Colorado in 1893, when she was about 20 years of age, perhaps as her family followed the railroad work westward. In fact, her life prior to Peabody is shrouded in mystery. Newspaper accounts suggest that she was a wealthy widow and well-traveled, but there is as yet little corroborating evidence for that description. Her first husband, James W. Bryant, may have been a photographer, a mining investor, or possibly a construction worker who was killed in an accident in San Francisco in 1907. There is as yet no definitive evidence regarding the various possibilities. But we do know that Mary Sullivan's parents separated and possibly divorced at some point along the way, unusual for Irish Catholics at that time. Her father living the remainder of his life in California near Los Angeles, and her mother living her remaining years in Kane County, Illinois.
However, and wherever they met, Mary Sullivan Bryant seems to have brought Francis comfort, distraction, and companionship. The couple married in a relatively quiet ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City on February 26, 1909, far different from his high society wedding to May Henderson 21 years earlier. The low-key nature of the wedding ceremony, as well as it being held in New York City, away from the prying eyes of his privileged Chicago social circle, may have been intentional, as the couple may have wanted to keep her background away from any sort of scrutiny.
Within a year of their wedding and an extensive honeymoon in Europe, Peabody purchased 110 acres of property to the south of 31st Street in rural DuPage County, Illinois, a few miles northwest of Hinsdale. Local newspapers reported that he intended to build an elaborate 50-room mansion situated on a large country estate, and that landscaping was already well underway. But by March of the following year, in early 1911, the same newspaper reported that the Peabodys had instead purchased a grand house in Hinsdale, perhaps giving up on the idea of building an extensive estate. In fact, they had purchased the Robbins House at 8 East 3rd Street, a large sprawling Queen Anne wood frame house that was the former home of George B. Robbins, the original developer of Hinsdale, and where for a few years they split their time between their apartment in the city along Michigan Avenue and their bucolic homestead in Hinsdale.
This interest in a country estate may have been inspired by the newlywed Peabodys' extended trip in Europe, where the class of people that Peabody aspired to emulate oftentimes held vast landholdings centered by regal homes. It may also be true that Peabody had conversations with his friend and business partner, Samuel Insull, electric utility and railroad magnate, who had himself purchased a large estate in Libertyville, Lake County, Illinois, in 1906, and was known to have had some influence with Peabody.
Having accumulated significant wealth and national prestige by this time, Francis Peabody seems to have been kicking back a bit, taking a few extended trips with his wife Mary, something he had not done with his first wife May, taking up horseback riding and golf, and more often retreating back to his house in the bucolic western suburbs of Chicago. And with each passing year, he appeared to be thinking more and more of retirement, of creating a gentleman's farm, over which he could daily ride his favorite horse, survey his large estate, dote on his prized farm animals, direct his loyal and contented staff, before heading back to a large and sumptuous house to be served his evening supper, then a game of poker while chewing on a good cigar, a shower and a sauna, a careful read by the fireplace of a cherished Robert Louis Stevenson novel with a snifter of brandy, followed by blissful sleep in a comfortable bed.
The purchase of the spacious Hinsdale house, however, did not stop Peabody from proceeding with his plan for a large country estate, as had been thought. It merely gave him a more local and strategic position, by which he could oversee and organize his planned estate just a few miles away. In 1912, he hired architect Alfred Hopkins to design a large barn facility on his property for housing dozens of prized dairy cows, as well as advertising for dairy workers. Later that year, he purchased an additional 78 acres to the west of his original 110 acres. The following year, in 1913, he acquired a herd of Exmoor sheep from England and was advertising for experienced farmhands. He added another 150 acres of land to the southwest of his original property and started making elaborate plans for a large poultry operation on his growing Peabody farms. To that end, Peabody convinced Crystal Hatcheries, an established poultry farmer, to relocate to his facilities with plans for 20,000 birds, including chickens, geese, ducks, pheasants, turkeys, and pigeons. This Crystal Hatcheries coup was another feather in his cap, so to speak.
It was at about this time that Peabody began extensive landscaping of his newly acquired grounds, reshaping the natural wetlands that drained into the Salt Creek to the east in order to create a small lake. This water feature was created by carving out the silts that had been deposited in this marshy environment for millennia, and by using some of the sediments to dam the water's natural drainage outlet into the small lake to the east, referred to as the Gulf. At that time, the Gulf was primarily used for annual winter ice harvesting, supplying ice to local dairy farms, the ice being used to refrigerate dairy products throughout the year. Peabody's newly created lake sat within a higher terrace than the Gulf Lake, with the water level being more than 15 feet higher as a result. This higher water level was maintained by a purpose-built lock, which managed the flow of water between the two small lakes. The artificial lake had the effect of removing an undesirable marshy area from Peabody's property, providing water for his recent startup poultry farm, and serving as a scenic backdrop for the stately house that he hoped to someday build. The new lake was named Mayslake, ostensibly in honor of Peabody's daughter May, and possibly for his first wife, May Henderson.
But Peabody's fervid farm project was seemingly suspended in 1914, and for good reason, that being pressing familial obligations. Both of his children, Stuyvesant and May, had weddings early in the year, daughter May being married to Addison Stillwell in early January at St. James Episcopal Church in Chicago, and son Stuyvesant being married to Anita Healy in a Roman Catholic ceremony at Holy Name Cathedral just 6 weeks later in February. Stuyvesant had converted to Roman Catholicism in preparation for their nuptials. Both Peabody weddings were highly visible and noteworthy affairs in the high society of Chicago at that time. By the end of 1914, the Peabodys came to know their first grandchildren, a daughter born to May and Addison Stillwell, and a son born to Stuyvesant and Anita Peabody. Meanwhile, 30 miles to the north, Peabody's business friend, Sam Insull, had broken ground on a spacious and resplendent mansion as a centerpiece for his large estate, Hawthorne Farms in Libertyville, Illinois.
The year 1915 saw the acquisition of 80 additional acres located to the southwest of the Peabody property, the estate now totaling almost 420 acres of land, sufficiently large for hosting extended fox hunts on weekends. In support of this new hobby, in 1916, Peabody expanded his farm operations to include horse breeding. Naturally, he purchased prize-winning horses as the nucleus for his horse farm. To keep and show his prize-winning horses, he also began construction of an extensive horse barn, complete with a show ring and spectator facilities, as well as an indoor arena over 200 feet in length by nearly 40 feet in width. Peabody Farms officially took on a new name, too, Mayslake Farms, reflecting one of the estate's newest and most charming features. Far to the north in Libertyville, Samuel Insull, Peabody's friend and confidant, completed construction of his mansion on his vast Hawthorne estate.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, war was raging on the European continent. The Allied powers of Europe, Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and others, were locked in a terrible conflict with Europe's Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. In spite of the bloodshed and turmoil, the United States was ensconced in one of its more isolationist moments and was initially reluctant to take sides. However, Germany's provocative sinking of U.S. ships and vessels in British waters forced the hand of U.S. lawmakers, who voted to declare war on Germany in April of 1917. The U.S. was anticipating a long and difficult conflict, based on stories filtering in from the battlefields of France and Belgium.
To assist in defense during this moment of national crisis, wealthy men were often appointed to lead various task forces and blue ribbon panels. There was indeed a genuine desire by these men to do some good for their country in these situations, a deep and abiding sense of patriotism guiding them. But it is also true that these individuals were guided by the principles which had driven them their entire working lives, the canons of capitalism and the sirens of self-interest. And so these leadership appointments also became an opportunity to influence government policy and steer public funding to the benefit of their businesses. Insull was appointed chairman of the Illinois War Council. Peabody was appointed as chairman of the Coal Production Committee of the Council of National Defense. He also served as assistant to the director of the Bureau of Mines, mostly to regulate the manufacturing of explosives in the U.S.
In spite of concerns over a long, drawn-out conflict, fortunately for the United States, the Great War overseas ended within 21 months of the U.S. declaration of war, with an armistice signed in November of 1918. The U.S. entry into the conflict had helped to tip the scales against Germany, now forced to sue for peace with the Allied powers.
But the Great War did have more subtle and long-lasting effect on the U.S. economy. The military production machine that resulted from the U.S. entering the war laid bare the United States' enormous dependence upon coal and the coal industry. Military expenditures piqued demand for manufacturing and transportation, which then piqued demand for coal, as at that time virtually all U.S. energy demands were being met by coal for heating, coal for electrical generation, and coal for transportation, in the form of steam-powered train locomotives and steam ships. The U.S.'s major coal operators, which included Peabody Coal, were victims of their own success. They had driven demand to the point that the U.S.'s consumption was reaching far beyond coal production and accessibility. This led to major coal shortages and large fluctuations in coal prices. Indeed, there were times when there was insufficient coal to power the trains which would have brought the coal to market.
The overproduction and the constant pressure to generate more coal resulted in great dissatisfaction among coal workers, who saw their wages as insufficient, the working hours too long, and the working conditions as hazardous. Coal labor unions added to the economic uncertainty with multiple labor strikes, crippling U.S. industry and transportation. It reached a point at which the U.S. government was threatening to take over the ownership of coal mines and mining operations, so as to regulate production and stabilize prices. Not surprisingly, coal operators such as Peabody used every ounce of their influence to prevent this from happening.
Throughout the economic maelstrom that marked the closing years of the 1910s and the early 1920s, the Peabodys continued to pour energy and resources into many of their pastimes and diversions. Mary Sullivan Peabody kept busy by entering her favorite horses into various horse shows, both locally and in New York and Kentucky. Horses Great Heart, Commodore, and Red Heart took multiple honors in 1918, 1919, and 1920. She, along with Stuyvesant's wife Anita, also bred Irish Terriers and entered their dogs in multiple dog shows in 1919 and 1920, including the Westminster Kennel Show in New York. In February of 1919, Francis Peabody and wife Mary Sullivan Peabody found time to take a boat trip to Cuba from Key West, Florida.
Then in March of 1919, after 4 years of real estate inactivity, Francis Peabody suddenly acquired another parcel of land, relatively small at 25 acres, but contiguous with his property, fronting 31st Street, and which grew Mayslake Farms to almost 450 acres. Although only a relatively small allotment of land, these 25 acres seem to have been key to Peabody's overall building plans, as it was to provide the setting for his grand residence and entrance into his Mayslake estate. And it is possible that he had been negotiating for this property from early days of planning. But with this parcel now within his holdings, by mid-1919, Peabody launched construction of his new residence, designed by Chicago architect Benjamin H. Marshall. Marshall was the same architect who had designed the grand residence of Peabody's good friend, Samuel Insull, in Libertyville several years earlier. The builder for the Peabody residence was Midland Engineering and Construction Company of Chicago. Peabody's new residence was to be of Tudor Revival design, a sprawling 26,000 square feet in size, of brick and stucco construction, 2 stories with 39 rooms, topped by a slate gable roof. It was to be Peabody's retirement home, where he could display his wealth, his good husbandry of livestock, and his English pedigree.
But this was not the only major change in Peabody's life, as his various positions in a national advisory role related to the coal industry apparently gave him a renewed interest and diversion into national politics. He threw his hat into the ring as a U.S. Senator for Illinois, under the Democratic ticket, at about the same time that he began the building of his new home on the outskirts of Hinsdale, and the chances for his party's nomination looked exceedingly good. On a more domestic front, by now a few more Peabody grandchildren had been added to his growing extended family.
But business pressures continued unabated when the United Mine Workers called for a massive labor strike in November of 1919, which formally lasted for almost 6 weeks. The ongoing stress and demands of his business empire, with the tug of extended family and the diversions of his new farm and politics, appears to have tipped Peabody into taking the first move towards retirement by stepping down as president of the Peabody Coal Company in late 1919 and simultaneously promoting his 31-year-old son, Stuyvesant, into that position, with Francis continuing on as the company's chairman.
With the construction of his new house in full swing, Peabody seems to have focused his attention towards expanding his Mayslake estate holdings. He purchased an additional 163 acres to the south of the original property in March of 1920, putting his properties at over 600 acres. Just a few months later, although a virtual shoo-in for the nomination of the Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate, in a surprising move, Peabody curiously withdrew his name from consideration, stating that he believed that he could have more influence as a private citizen than as a candidate for the U.S. Senate.
At this time, coal labor strife and tensions remained high, as many workers in Illinois, Kansas, and Indiana remained dissatisfied with the negotiations of the 1919 strike. They agitated for better wages and threatened a general strike. With the ongoing news of revolution, Bolshevik uprisings, and Red Army victories in faraway Russia, continual labor strikes within the U.S. sent waves of fear rippling through the population as to whether something similar could happen in the United States. President Woodrow Wilson was sufficiently concerned about the continued labor strife and its destabilizing effects upon the economy to send a telegram to the Coal Workers Union, admonishing them as to their moral duty and social responsibility to return to work immediately.
In late July of 1920, while threats of the strike loomed, a mining accident occurred in one of Peabody's downstate Illinois mines, in which 40-year-old Philip White, one of Peabody's mine superintendents, lost his life, overcome by noxious mine gases while attempting to save the life of another worker. Peabody, along with his son Stuyvesant, personally attended the man's funeral and pledged to continue paying Philip White's salary to his widow for the remainder of her life, as well as paying for the costs and education associated with White's children. It was a noble gesture, to be sure, but it also sent a message of solidarity to his loyal managers, who were taking the brunt of the ongoing labor strife issues.
Meanwhile, back at Mayslake Farm, the construction of the new residence continued. And in September of 1920, Peabody again added to his acreage, purchasing 80 acres contiguous to the south of his property, along Ogden Avenue, his estate now totaling nearly 690 acres. During the construction, Francis and Mary Peabody continued to live at their home on 3rd Street in Hinsdale, and they also kept an apartment in Chicago at the Palmer House Hotel on Michigan Avenue. The very next month, in anticipation of their imminent move to their new residence, the Peabodys hosted an extravagant horse show at the Mayslake Farm, a 2-day affair with the proceeds benefiting the Salvation Army, one of Peabody's favorite charities.
After 2 years of construction, during the summer of 1921, the Peabodys formally moved from their house in Hinsdale and their Chicago apartment to their new Mayslake residence. It was something of a ragged move, as some construction was still ongoing, especially of the service buildings, including the large formal gatehouse along 31st Street. The Mayslake Gatehouse was a substantial two-story Tudor residence where the estate manager, Albert Cox, and his family lived. The Gatehouse complex included a west range of buildings and a north range, fronting 31st Street, where horses, buggies, and automobiles were stabled. No doubt there were many finished details yet to be completed, and so it is likely that the estate saw a steady stream of tradesmen completing one task or another. As such, final decorating was deferred. Instead, the Peabodys temporarily moved their existing furnishings from their Hinsdale home and their Chicago apartment, including multiple Oriental and chenille rugs. To close out 1921, Peabody continued to augment his Mayslake land holdings and acquired an additional 160 acres, again to the southeast of his estate, along Ogden Avenue. His Mayslake farm estate now credited at nearly 850 acres in size.
Early 1922 saw the Peabodys acclimating to their new quarters, amidst the confusion and clutter of final construction. Many decisions needed to be made regarding final decor, including furniture and draperies. They found time to decorate one first-floor room, that being the sun parlor, as well as to place a substantial order for new custom furniture from William J. Quigley and Company, an exclusive furniture maker in Chicago, for the price of $3,200. As with the interior, only basic landscaping had been done around the exterior of the new residence. Grass was seeded and trees were planted. Formal garden plans for the front and rear of the building were drawn up, but the work had not yet begun.
By now, Peabody's business, the Peabody Coal Company, had grown to be the third largest coal producer and the largest privately owned coal company in the United States. But continued tensions with coal labor prevented Peabody from basking in this accomplishment. Indeed, on April 1, 1922, the United Mine Workers once again called for a nationwide coal strike, demanding higher wages and better working conditions. Without workers, coal mines shut down across the country. Coal shortages intensified, affecting virtually every segment of society. Pressure was mounting on coal operators, including Francis Peabody and his son Stuyvesant, to acquiesce so that mines could be reopened.
The spring of 1922 was also marred by the deaths of a Peabody family member, as well as a workman on the Mayslake estate. Mary Sullivan Peabody's father, Maurice Sullivan, passed away in Los Angeles, California, in late April. Just a few days later, in early May, and in something of a bad omen, one of the workmen, a plasterer, Julius Kurth, working on the ceiling in the gatehouse, fell to the hard floor surface below when scaffolding broke, fracturing his skull and resulting in his death. In the months of summer, as the coal strike dragged on, Francis Peabody made a final augmentation of his Mayslake estate, leasing an additional 80 acres along Ogden Avenue. The size of his farm, including the lease, now stood at almost 930 acres, its area having been more than doubled since 1919, when the Peabodys first began construction of their retirement residence. In spite of mounting pressures related to his business, things were falling into place for Peabody, now looking forward to retirement as a gentleman farmer on his now expansive farm and estate.
The final weekend of August 1922 brought clear skies and fair weather, and unseasonably cool temperatures. The Peabodys, led by son Stuyvesant and his wife Anita, arranged for the first fox hunt of the season on the Mayslake estate for Sunday, inviting a handful of close associates. This was a simulated hunt, along a planned route which featured much of the recently added area to the south of the Peabody's great house. The route was created by dragging a bag of anise oil, creating a scented trail or spoor, which the hunting dogs followed, and with the mounted fox hunters in avid pursuit. It is something of an obstacle course on horseback, in the guise of a symbolic chase.
On this particular morning, Mary Sullivan Peabody was said to have been feeling unwell, and so watched the hunt from the comfort of her second-story bedroom, with views overlooking Mayslake and the landscape beyond. Francis Peabody, too, was feeling a bit under the weather, but did not want to miss the outing on such a beautiful morning. Although he mounted up his favorite horse Dunbar and rode, he told his son to go ahead and lead the hunt, while he would follow at a distance and keep watch.
The excitement of the ensuing hunt sent dogs and horse riders careening to and fro, through fields, foliage, and forests, to the south of the Peabody house, until they ended up at Ogden Avenue, then a dirt road, about 1.5 miles south from the house, where the spoor trail ended. Being among the first riders to the spot took pride of place among the avid equestrians. As the remaining riders trickled in from the woods and fields, it was noticed that Francis was not among them, even after a considerable interval. Using a nearby service building with a telephone, Stuyvesant called the gatehouse and lodge at the north end of the Peabody property, thinking that his father may have doubled back due to a problem with his horse. Estate Superintendent, 35-year-old Albert E. Cox, informed Stuyvesant that Mr. Peabody had not returned to the lodge and that he was unaware of his whereabouts.
Accordingly, Cox set out on foot to find the missing Peabody and his horse. As the gatehouse was situated along 31st Street, he headed south towards the path of the hunt, which would have taken him past the Peabody house. Walking briskly, within 10 minutes he would have spotted Peabody's horse, Dunbar, standing at a distance to the south of Mayslake and the Gulf, perhaps a few hundred feet from the Mayslake Lock. As he approached the horse, Cox realized that Dunbar was standing over the body of his owner, Francis Peabody. Seeking help, Cox, himself a knowledgeable horseman, reportedly then mounted Peabody's horse and rode Dunbar to the south so as to alert Stuyvesant's hunting party. Stuyvesant, upon seeing Cox approaching on Peabody's horse, immediately knew that something was amiss. Upon learning of his stricken father's whereabouts, Stuyvesant and the group hastily returned to the southern knoll of Mayslake and attempted to revive the fallen Peabody. But all attempts were futile.
Cox and members of the hunting party would then have borne Peabody back to the great house, where Mary Peabody and the household would have been informed, and where excited phone calls would have been made to local medical doctors, summoning their help. But any real medical assistance would have taken tens of minutes, or more than an hour from when Cox found Peabody by the lake. All subsequent attempts to revive or resuscitate the master of the estate were in vain. Francis Stuyvesant Peabody, a captain of the U.S. coal industry, lord of the Mayslake Manor, had passed away at the age of 63 years, on a beautiful morning, riding his favorite horse, and doing something that he loved.
In the days that followed, subsequent medical opinion was that Peabody had died as a result of a massive heart attack, that feeling unwell, he had dismounted his horse before falling to the ground, with death coming quickly. Peabody's friends surmised that the stress related to the recent coal workers' strike had recently weakened his constitution, as he had been hitherto in good health.
A modest funeral was quickly arranged within a few days' time, held in the late afternoon of Tuesday, August 29th, at Peabody's new residence. The grand building where he had hoped to spend years of retirement and entertaining was christened as the place of his last rites and services. The funeral services were conducted by Reverend Harry Loder Cawthorn, the pastor of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, located at Western Avenue in Chicago, also an Englishman and contemporary of Peabody's. Pallbearers for the ceremony were friends, blue bloods, and business associates: George Fulmer Getz, Frederick William Upham, C.D. Caldwell, C.J. Gray, Henry Hooper Jr., N.F. Pelletier, Gerard B. Winston, and George W. Reed. Following the service, Peabody was laid to rest in nearby Bronzewood Cemetery, also known as Hinsdale Cemetery, in what is today Oak Brook, Illinois, only a mile or so distant from his estate.
As a final tribute to Francis S. Peabody, the Peabody Coal Company closed all of its mines in 7 states on the day of his funeral. But as coal workers were paid by the day and hours worked, this was effectively docking the pay of the 20,000 workers that manned Peabody's mines. Needless to say, the unexpected day off did not go over well with Peabody's coal workers. Ironically, the National Coal Workers' Strike that so vexed Peabody in his final months was officially ended just a few days after his death in the first week of September.
In our next video, we'll tell what happened to the Mayslake property following the death of Francis Peabody, the settling of the estate, the arrival of the Franciscans, the rise and demise of a popular Roman Catholic retreat, and its eventual transformation into a public forest preserve. Many thanks to the DuPage County Forest Preserve staff and the many volunteers that support them. Thanks too to our Patreon supporters. If you're enjoying these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment. And if you're so inclined, consider supporting us on Patreon. It helps our channel to grow and enables us to make more videos just like this. We'll see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.